Hello and welcome to Innovation Celebration, the show where we celebrate recent developments in science and technology, the people and ideas that make them possible, and discuss the ways in which they enhance human flourishing. Just to remind everyone that on this show, when we endorse, when we talk about a particular development, we will celebrate the people involved, but we're not necessarily endorsing them or everything they do or the organizations they work for. Just a little disclaimer to say, we'll celebrate somebody for the good work they've done, but that's not a unanimous endorsement. So today, as you can see, I'm traveling. I'm in a hotel room. I'm in Turkey for another week or so yet. And Angelica is back home in America, so we're on different screens, but it shouldn't be like that for too long. So please put up with the new paradigm while it lasts. So without any further ado, I'm Thomas Walker.
And I'm Angelica Werth, and we'll go ahead and jump into our first topic for today, which is a graphene additive to make a new nano-ink to make smaller, more flexible electronic components. So the people that are doing this, which as Tom mentioned, we are not blanket endorsing, but this is being done by a team at Kansas State University, including Professors Suprem Das, who's a professor of engineering, and Christopher Sorensen, who's a professor of physics. And I'll read from the article briefly a brief quote about what their research has shown, what the paper they published is about. It is about ways to manufacture graphene-based nano-inks for additive manufacturing of supercapacitors in the form of flexible and printable electronics.
Now, hang on, you have supercapacitors and another kind, don't you, that really mean the same thing?
Well, hold on, we'll get there. So I'm going to break down all of those terms because if you're like me, electronics isn't really your field. And so I had to really dig into this one to understand fully what's going on here. So I'm going to explain it to you guys the way that I had to learn it to understand it myself, which will come to the point about supercapacitors.
Right.
But just going in the order of what was in that quote, yeah. So the material that they're using is called graphene, and graphene is a form of carbon that's just a single layer of atoms in a 2D structure, but it's like a crystalline kind of, not crystalline, that's
a lattice, I think.
Lattice structure, honeycomb, that's the word I was looking for, a honeycomb lattice structure.
But it's a kind of two-dimensional honeycomb, not
yes, two-dimensional, not like what bees live in.
Yeah.
And if you have multiple layers of graphene, then you get graphite. So hence the similarity in the names there. The "ene" suffix just means that there are two or more double bonds. So if you remember your high school chemistry, the bonds that we're talking about here are chemical bonds, which is the attraction between atoms, ions, or molecules. And they form these bonds by sharing electrons. And the number of electrons that they share determines whether it's single, double, or triple bond. So that's what graphene is. That's the material that they're using to make these nano-inks. And the idea behind nano-inks is they take these materials, such as graphene, they can also use silver nanoparticles and a couple of others, that are very conducive, like they can conduct a lot, can conduct a lot of electricity.
Conducting.
Yes, at a low density. So without much material, they can conduct a lot of electrical charge. And so they incorporate these materials into inks so that they can use standard printing technology to produce electronic components such as electric circuits and displays and things like that. So these are being used, perhaps not surprisingly, in additive manufacturing, which is just a fancy way of talking about 3D printing, which is still a really cool concept, where they print out different layers of things and create an actual 3D structure. And in this case, they're being used to create supercapacitors. Supercapacitors, this is what Tom was asking about earlier. Supercapacitors and ultracapacitors are the same thing. People just can't agree on the right prefix. They both just mean a capacitor that has 10 to 100 times the capacitance of a normal capacitor.
Yes, so sort of to use a more familiar, similar thing, it's a bit like how calories and kilocalories are actually the same thing.
Yeah. A capacitor, though, is something that stores electrical charge and electrical field in an electrical field. And the capacitance that we're talking about is just the ability of how much charge that it can hold. As I said, a supercapacitor can hold 10 to 100 times more than a regular capacitor, but it can't handle as much voltage, so as much electrical pressure at one time. Now, again, if you're like me, just kind of stepping into this field of electronics, you're like, well, this sounds like a battery. And it does function very similar to a battery, but there are some advantages of using a capacitor over a battery. And those advantages are that they have a much longer life cycle. So some of you are familiar with, rechargeable batteries. And capacitors can be recharged in the same way, but many more times than can a regular battery. And it also can just hold, these supercapacitors anyway, can hold much more charge than can a typical battery.
And there's another advantage as well, which is batteries, particularly larger batteries like you get in electric cars and phones and things like that, require so many exotic materials. Yeah. And the amount of mining for things like cobalt that you have to do to manufacture those batteries is very costly. Mm-hmm. Not to mention the controversy it causes for other reasons.
Right, and that's like, as I was saying, that's one of the benefits of these nano-inks is these materials are conducive at such low concentrations that you don't need much of the material, so it's pretty cheap to produce. So the main application of these supercapacitors is for flexible and printable electronics. And I'm sure you guys have all noticed that wearable electronics like your Apple Watches and your fitness watches, those sorts of things are becoming more and more popular. So having electronics that can be on a mechanically flexible material provides a number of advantages if you're trying to manufacture something like that. So what Das and Sorensen have done specifically is they've developed smaller supercapacitors using Das's patented way of producing graphene, which goes to Tom's point earlier, that can be printed onto mechanically flexible surfaces. So starting from the beginning, Das has patented a way to make graphene that basically just uses saturated hydrocarbons. So if you remember the chemical bonds we were talking about before, these are carbon molecules that use triple bonds instead of double bonds. And you use one of those, such as acetylene is the example he prefers, in a chamber with oxygen, and you can make graphene. Obviously, no toxic chemicals, no cobalt mining, nothing like that involved, and it's a really cheap way to produce graphene. So using this technique and their design, you can make even smaller supercapacitors that can be printed onto mechanically flexible surfaces. They've tested these with 10,000 cycles of charging and use, these supercapacitors, and they've held up.
Yeah. And to sort of put that to scale, like just to understand how big a number that is, like if you charge a phone once a day, how many years is that? That's like 20, 30 years worth of charging.
Right.
So,
yeah. So it's quite a large number. And that's, like I said, that's one of the advantages of the capacitor. The other advantage of a capacitor over a battery is just that they charge more quickly.
So your phone charges up instantly and you can keep charging it for decades.
Exactly, yeah. That would be the equivalent if we were using capacitors in phones instead of batteries. And the flexible surface that they tested, this new microcapacitor that they printed using 3D printing, is on a plastic called polyamide that's 20 micrometers thin. So if you're not familiar with a micrometer, it's a 1,000th. Sorry,
it's 1,000th of a millimeter, so 1/10,000th of a centimeter.
1/10,000th of a centimeter, yeah, thank you. So very, very thin, very flexible surface. So we'll see these kinds of designs hopefully being put to work to develop smaller, more flexible, and 3D printable electronics, which is really exciting. A great way to see the industry going.
Awesome. So my first big shout out is to the recent announcement of the findings from an experiment in which beating heart cells were taken into space. So I'll try and start at the beginning here. A researcher called Chunwei Xu, if I'm hopefully pronounced that correctly, I did look it up, from the Emory University School of Medicine. She was researching essentially using stem cells called pluripotents to grow beating heart cells, which I've lost the word, cardiomyocytes. And so those cells, basically, you can using the stem cells, you can grow the cells you need to repair somebody's heart if it's going wrong, if it's got something wrong with it. Unfortunately, the stumbling block that you run into trying to use stem cells in these kinds of applications is you need billions of the things to repair an actual heart. If you have any idea how many cells are in a human organ, and they just don't grow quickly enough. So one thing that Chan Wei-Shu tried to do was she put these cells into what's called a random positioning machine. And that reorients the cells continuously. So your cells, some of them at least, have a sort of sense of up and down, necessary, sort of a similar way to how plants do, necessarily because of how they operate. The gravity has an impact on how chemical exchange and things like that happen. So she was constantly moving them around with this machine, so they never got a sense of up or down. And that actually led to them grow quickly. So logical next step, she thought, was to send them into space, into a completely zero gravity environment, and see how they perform there. So they launched on a SpaceX rocket to the International Space Station in March last year. NASA astronaut Jessica Meir conducted the experiment in orbit. And I want to give a shout out to SpaceX on this one as well, because I'll link to a study about this in the description, but SpaceX have reduced the cost of launching into orbit 40% roughly compared to government launches that were available before. And that's with a lot of government regulation, as this study mentions, still constraining and adding to their launch cost. And that has the obvious benefit of satellites can be launched more cheaply for communications, for military uses, whatever. But it also helps get these kinds of, it opens up access to space to these kinds of uses. So universities don't have to work with inordinately expensive NASA launchers anymore. SpaceX provides more access to this. It's not such an out of reach domain to do science in. Now, obviously, the International Space Station is still a government facility. Indeed, about 12 different governments jointly run it, hence its name. And but can you imagine if there were private medical facilities in orbit? And I think that kind of thing is coming. So the potential of that is enormous. And this is more broadly a really good example of how spaceflight has so many more benefits than just the obvious, observation, communication, discovery about the universe. Oh, it's cool to be in space kind of stuff. Like there's so much science that's been done in space about cancer treatments, about animals, about plants growing foods, and now these kinds of medical applications. That zero gravity environment is, or microgravity to give it its proper name, is really, really useful for developing new technologies and new medical treatments. So in terms of applications, this is sort of the primary direction of this research is in treating heart disease and heart defects in children and in adults. And do you want to come in with something there?
Yeah, well, the key reason that is a big deal, and this is a life-saving achievement, is that cardiovascular diseases, according to the World Health Organization, are the #1 cause of death worldwide, estimated to take about 18 million lives each year. So this is the importance of how many lives this could save and improve cannot be understated.
Yeah, so I mean, and that's just if this leads to saving at least some of those lives, then that's just a phenomenal achievement. But the benefits don't even end there. It's also useful in terms of researching heart function more generally, learning more about how the heart operates, and apparently, according to the study, I don't fully understand how, but it's also useful for understanding the aging process. And I'm a big fan of trying to combat aging and extend our lives as much as possible as well. So if that's another benefit of this, then even better. So really exciting study, and very interested to see where that goes from here on out.
Absolutely. And just to be clear, they're not planning to grow heart cells in space permanently,
No.
are you?
No, although you could see probably a situation where that's viable, and if spaceflight keeps growing the way it is in at some point in the future. But at the moment, the plan is to recreate zero-G environments on Earth, probably using centrifuges and things like that.
Yeah, they can do that fairly easily in a lab.
Yeah, and grow them that way.
Cool.
The advantage in space is that you get this complete microgravity environment where you can do anything you want, and you don't have to spin anything up and constrain. You can use as much space as you like and watch how things act completely naturally.
For sure. Awesome.
Yeah.
So I think that wraps up our main topics. We have a few honorable mentions each today. First one I wanted to start off with is the new magnification of atoms. So a team at Cornell University, led by David Muller, have obtained the highest resolution picture of an atom that has ever been captured. They've managed to magnify it by 100 million times. So that's, a factor of a few times over what the previous high resolution picture was, which is pretty cool.
Your micrometer from your earlier one is going to look, impossibly gigantic on this scale.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And so the technique that they used this technique has existed for a while. They managed to innovate the use of this technique to get it into the level that they needed. So it's called electron tychography, which has a P in the front like pterodactyl, but it's silent.
That's probably, for the British listeners, tychography, I imagine.
Probably. But basically how this technique works is by shooting electrons at the target material. And previously, it's only been used to study things that are just a couple of layers of atoms thick. But this team has managed to innovate a technique to use it to look at things that are 30 to 50 nanometers thick, so several more layers of atoms thick, which will be useful, hopefully, also to material scientists, because that's about the range of samples of things that they're looking at. So that's an immediate application, and I imagine we'll see more. Literally everything is made of atoms, obviously, so being able to see them better can only be a good thing.
Yeah, no, that would be very useful for chemistry and physics going forward. And it's also just really cool to look at a picture of an atom. That's something you dream of as a kid and don't think that's ever going to happen.
Yeah.
So speaking of things I dreamt of as a kid, I was very much into paleontology when I was younger, and the study of prehistory. And we all know lots about dinosaurs, and the dinosaurs lived 220 to about 65 million years ago. Before them, which I found kind of more interesting because we don't have movies about that stuff, but so it's kind of a bit more mysterious. About 500 to about 220 million years ago, there were various epochs of fish, amphibians, and reptiles that preceded the dinosaurs. Before that is much more mysterious, and what I wanted to talk about today is the discovery in China of what they're calling a mass grave of 2,846 separate fossils that's been discovered, which date 518 million years ago. So this is very early in the Cambrian period, which is really the first period of modern life as we know it. So the period before that, which I can never remember the name of, begins with E, but it's called the Precambrian to combine a number of periods together. I can't remember the specific one before, but there was multicellular life in that earlier period, but most of that, all of it actually really disappeared in the Cambrian because the new emergent life forms just overran it and really set the template for everything that's existed since. So these are the sort of the real antecedents of all multicellular life. And in this discovery, there are 118 species, 17 of which are newly discovered. This is called the Haiyan Lagerstatt. Lagerstatt is a German word that means a situation in which several layers of sediment have been deposited on top of each other.
This is the site name you're saying, yes?
Yeah, so the site name is the Haiyan. Haiyan, I'm assuming, is a place in China. Lagerstatt, but Lagerstatts have existed in other locations. So what's happened here is some kind of violent, dramatic event just covered this nursery in one flash event. With sediment and rock, it's sediment from what I'm reading, but probably as a result of this event, crystallized very quickly and then relayered upon repeatedly after that. So it's insulated from air, from water, from everything that might cause rotting to happen. So these things are just perfectly preserved. So in this discovery, you've got eyes and flesh and things like that you don't normally get in fossils, just really well intact. So there's so much learning that can happen here, and you have juvenile forms of these creatures as well. You have children with adults. It looks like a breeding ground, so you learn about their development. You learn how the early evolution of growth kind of happened, of how species developed from an adolescent into an adult. The other thing I wanted to say about this really was just to call out Sarah Kimmig, who was the lead researcher on the project. So as I say, really exciting to me, just window into really very, very early evolutionary history. You don't normally get detailed fossils from this early on. Like even the dinosaur era is hard to get good stuff from, but this is so much earlier.
So the ramifications for the understanding of how we developed, how life developed are huge from what I'm getting here. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really significant.
Awesome. So my next honorable mention is another life-saving development. There's been a very promising malaria vaccine trial. This was a very large team working on this trial. As a US-based endeavor. One of the many scientists on this team was Patrick Duffy. But this malaria vaccine, the way that it works is by using a shot with a live parasite in it. The parasite that causes malaria is called Plasmodium falciparum. And then the patients are immediately given drugs to fight the infection. And this small study was done on healthy adults. So obviously it needs to be tested on a large group, but in this small trial, it had 87.5% efficacy, which is huge compared to other malaria vaccines that are in play. For example, the World Health Organization has started to distribute some vaccines to children in Africa for malaria, but those vaccines only have a 39% efficacy. So huge increase. And there are other vaccines in development too, but really we can't have too many because of the impact, the size of the impact of malaria. It affects 200 million people worldwide every year, and 409,000 people die from it. Many of them are children. At least that was the estimated number from 2019. So that is quite horrible. But this new vaccine trial, 87.5% efficacy on the strain that they used, and they also tested patients against a different strain of malaria from Brazil, and it had a 67% efficacy rate against that. So huge potential here. Life-saving vaccines that they're working on is very exciting.
Wow, yes, no, comparing that to the COVID-19 vaccines, and I mean, their efficacy, at least the good ones, is impressively high. In the 80s and 90s, and typical flu vaccines are more in the 60s, if lower sometimes. So it really shows, when you really apply yourself to research, just what can be achieved.
Definitely.
So the next thing I want to talk about really hypes back to a point I made last week in two of my items last week about new empirical evidence adjusting previously held theories. Because this is two pieces of news that have come out in the last week, both of which pertain to neutron stars. So to give a quick bit of background, a neutron star is the core of a supermassive star. So a star that's the size of the sun, or up to about 8 times the size of the sun, when it reaches the end of its life, it expands into what's called a red giant, blows off some of its outer layers, and then collapses back and forms a white dwarf, which we'll come back to later, who's just a small, dense star that gradually fades and sort of unspectacularly dies off after a while, becomes a black dwarf. Giant stars, 8 times the size of the sun or larger, do something much more exciting. They explode dramatically as a supernova, and then collapse usually into a neutron star, which is extremely dense, fast spinning, highly energetic, has the massive, several suns in it, but it's the size of a moon. It's this very small object. Some of the really big supermassive stars will collapse into black holes, where the density is so high that even light can't escape the gravitational pull, and it becomes this vortex that sucks everything around it in. So the first piece of news is that through the use of gravitational wave detection, which is a really new thing that years ago was just theoretical, the first discovery of a neutron star and a black hole colliding has been observed. And this is happening 900 million light years away in a very distant galaxy. This happened 1 billion years ago. We've only just got the waves from it now. But previously, it was believed that neutron stars and black holes don't exist together in a common system. 2 of these collisions have been detected within 1 week, which indicates, hang on a minute, maybe they do. There are none discovered in our galaxy so far, but it's kind of time to start looking. And I wanted to read out a quote from Professor Vivian Raymond from Cardiff University, who worked on this project, who said the results were fantastic. He says, "We have to go back to the drawing board and rewrite our theories." He said effusively, according to BBC, "We have learned a bit of a lesson again. When we assume something, we tend to be proved wrong after a while. So we have to keep our minds open and see what the universe is telling us." And so I just want to bring back to that epistemological point of look at what reality is telling you. Your theories, are only as good as the evidence they're based on. When new evidence comes along, you have to reconsider those. And he makes that point, just like Israel did last week with the human discovery, makes that point really concisely, and I like that a lot. The other piece of news about neutron stars that's happened in the same week is a white dwarf star, which I was saying is the remnant of a smaller star it reached the end of its life. This is only 130 light years away. This is sort of in our neighborhood, galactically speaking. It's in our region of the Milky Way galaxy. Appears to be undergoing collapse into a neutron star. So that's never ever been observed before. This is a really, really small white, but only 4,300 kilometers. It's about 2,600 miles across. So it's the size of North America, but it's 1.35 times the mass of the sun, which is 99% the mass of the solar system. So there's an enormous amount of mass packed into a really small object, and that extreme density resulting from that appears to be triggering this collapse into a neutron star state. So this is another theory that's gone out the window, which is that neutron stars only form when massive stars collapse. This seems to be a white dwarf collapsing into a neutron star is a possible second route to neutron star formation, and whether that produces a different kind of neutron star will be interesting to observe. But again, it's revisiting theories when new evidence emerges.
Most definitely. So last honorable mention I wanted to give today is to a group of scientists that have gotten embryonic frog skin cells to become living things. And I'm going to explain that, but it's basically as weird as it sounds. So the team includes Michael Levin and Doug Blackiston. And what they've done is they took some skin cells from a frog embryo and grew them in containers with water, and they gave them sugar for nutrients. And what they found is that within a couple of days, these embryonic frog cells had formed themselves into little balls, and then repurposed the cilia that you would have on a frog's skin. So cilia are small hair-like structures that serve all kinds of purposes in living things. Lots of creatures have them, from bacteria to humans. And what frogs' skin usually uses them for is just to repel pathogens and to keep it away from them. What these small balls of frog skin cells, which they've named xenobots, which sounds like something out of science fiction, but anyway, they've called them xenobots.
I'm sure I've seen Doctor Who episodes where xenobots chase the Doctor around for 20 minutes.
I'm sure, yeah. But these xenobots use the cilia just to swim around in the water, basically, which is what bacteria use them for, is a way of moving. And these xenobots are really, really cool. You can cut them almost in half and they will heal. They've been put into dishes with iron oxide particles, and they'll sweep them into piles. They can swim through little tubes, and they can survive up to 10 days without any food. If you do feed them, then they can survive for at least 4 months. That's how long they've managed to grow them in the lab so far. So potential applications of these, because they're able to sweep the debris into a pile, the scientists were thinking, well, maybe we could use them to clean up waterways, to get into small spaces that it's hard for a person to get into to clean up. There's also the potential of, because they're able to swim through tubes and things, potentially using them to clean up like the arteries of a patient who's got blocked arteries, although that's a little bit of a weird thought to my mind. But if if it helps people who are developing those heart diseases, then maybe it's worth exploring. And then just expanding our understanding of how animals develop, because this is not something that we thought we would see from embryonic cells. As one of the researchers said, this is the type of evolution you expect to see over years and years, and this is happening in 2 or 3 days in the lab. So this is really fascinating. If you want to see pictures of these, sorry?
That's very exciting.
Yes. So Doug Blackiston, one of the scientists who worked on this project, collaborated with Science News to put together a 1-minute video. If you're curious to see this guys in action, they've got pictures of it. They've got video of them sweeping the iron oxide into piles. They've got video of them being nearly cut in half and healing again, obviously sped up. But all of that is in a 1-minute video that we'll link to below if you're curious.
Awesome. So for my final honorable mention, I wanted to talk about a new robot that's been developed by a company called Traptic, Traptic. And this is a strawberry picking robot. Now, you might be imagining something with lots of legs walking through a strawberry field. No, this is almost like a big truck on wheels that goes up and down the strawberry fields and uses a combination of machine learning and artificial intelligence to adapt and learn how to pick a strawberry well over the course of time. Now, for anyone who might say, oh, what about our jobs? Part of the reason that this is really cool is 10% of all strawberries that are grown in the USA rot and in the field. They're not even picked. So that costs farmers, the people who would be picking these otherwise, $300 million a year in waste. So this has a real potential to bring a lot more money in for struggling farmers. And obviously supply us with a lot more food in the process, which is probably the more important thing. Also a lot of farmers who are in this field have actually been suffering from labor shortages recently. That's been exacerbated by the visa restrictions in America because of COVID-19. So and before that, it's the world's hardest country to get into practically, maybe apart from like Libya. So it's going to help a lot of farmers who are going to be able to make money out of a lot more of their crop and avoid that wastage that's going on. It can also operate in conditions that human beings can't. So your really hot Florida summer. I don't know if they grow strawberries in Florida, maybe they do, but in particularly hot parts of the country, as mentioned in the article, conditions that a human being can't really go out picking strawberries in, but this machine can run through, or heavy rain or sort of other situations like that. And then I think you've mentioned to me as well that sort of this technology has been used with other fruits, but there's a distinct, or other things that you pick, but there's a distinction here.
Yeah, so a lot of, and particularly in greenhouses, they do use certain picking machines for things like cucumbers and peppers, tomatoes. The thing with strawberries is that they grow down, so like you can easily have a basket of strawberries and the strawberries will grow out into the side. So, kind of like a fountain, which makes it difficult for the machine to get under there and get into get to the actual strawberries. So that's really cool that they've managed to do that.
Yeah, and I wanted to also briefly talk about another robot. So when we were kind of coming up with this show, we sort of did a test research for an episode that we never made. And one of the things that was happening at that time is now worth mentioning, which is the Carbon Robotics Autonomous Weeder, which is a similar giant wheeled robot that drives up and down crop fields, but this one zaps weeds with lasers, which is a much cleaner and more efficient way of dealing with problematic weeds than going and pulling them out by hand or pouring pesticide on a whole field is. You're much less likely to damage the crops that you want to keep growing using this machine than you would be trying to deal with weeds any other way, and you don't have that problem of pesticides turning up on commercially sold fruits and vegetables and things like that. So another really interesting application of robotics to farming there as well.
Definitely. I think that's all we had for today. So just to wrap up, I talked about graphene-based nano-inks to create small printable electronics with a long life cycle.
I talked about growing zero-gravity heart cells to regenerate hearts in heart patients.
And for our honorable mentions, I talked about the picture of the atoms that's been magnified by 100 million times.
I talked next about the discovery of 4,000 or so new mass grave of Cambrian era. There we go, I get it right in the end. Fossils in China.
I talked about a promising trial of a malaria vaccine.
I talked about two pieces of news regarding neutron stars that remind us to look at evidence before jumping to conclusions about things.
I talked about frog skin cells that became living xenobots.
And I talked about a strawberry picking robot. Easy to remember that one.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us. And again, please pardon our travel setup. We will be back to normal, hopefully in a few weeks.